My name is Nora Whitaker. I am 34 years old, and the first thing my parents saw when they let themselves into my house was the empty space where my son's crib used to be. My father still had the key in his hand. He stood in the doorway of the nursery like the room had personally insulted him. Behind him, my mother held a pale blue gift bag from Target, the tissue paper crushed from where she had been gripping it too tightly during the drive. My sister Lila hovered near the hallway mirror, checking her face like she expected tears to make her look innocent, and beside her stood Brent Calder, her boyfriend, quiet and polished, with the same navy blazer he wore whenever he wanted people to mistake calculation for concern. The house was not empty. I had been careful about that. My father's toolbox was still in the basement from the shelf he never finished. The casserole dish my mother brought over 3 weeks earlier was washed and sitting on the counter. The guest towels Lila once called "too old lady" were still folded in the hall closet. I had taken only what belonged to me, what belonged to Caleb, and what my son needed. The crib was gone. The rocking chair was gone. The tiny clothes Judith had once promised to organize were gone. On the wall above the changing table, I left one photograph. It showed me in a hospital bed at UPMC McGee Women's, holding Miles Owen Whitaker against my chest, his eyes squeezed shut, his little mouth open like he was already objecting to the world he had entered. On the back, I wrote one sentence. His name is Miles Owen Whitaker. He was born at 3:42 a.m. while you were choosing Lila. Below that, I added, my attorney will handle all contact about me, my son, and my house. Check your email. But to understand why I left that room empty, you need to know what my mother said when I was on the kitchen floor, in labor, begging her to come. Please don't make us choose tonight. Before we begin, please subscribe to support the channel. And here is a fun little challenge. Check your phone battery right now. If it is above 23%, comment 1. If it is below 23%, comment 2. Let's see which answer wins today. If you enjoy this story and would like to support our team, you can buy us a cup of coffee through the link in the description. Every contribution helps us continue creating more meaningful, emotional, and captivating stories for you. Thank you so much for your kindness and support. Now, let's begin the story. My mother had been a teacher for 29 years before she retired, which meant she knew how to make neglect sound like patience. She never said she loved Lila more. She never had to. She only lowered her voice, touched my arm, and said, "Your sister is fragile, Nora. You've always been stronger." I used to accept that sentence like it was praise. Stronger meant I could wait. Stronger meant I could understand. Stronger meant if Lila fell apart, everyone ran toward her, and if I fell apart, everyone waited for me to clean it up quietly. That was my position in the family, long before Miles existed. I was the reliable one. Lila was the rescue. My father, Warren Whitaker, owned a small roofing company outside Cranberry Township, and he believed every family survived because someone carried the weight without complaining. Somehow that someone was always me. His favorite line was, "This family works because people step up." But Lila never had to step anywhere. If she overdrafted her account, it was a rough season. If she lost a contract, Mom drove over with soup. If I needed help, I was reminded I could manage. Lila was 29, a wedding content creator with soft curls, perfect lighting, and a talent for turning inconvenience into injury. When one bride canceled a package, my mother spent half the night at Lila's apartment. When Lila cried because Brent had not answered her calls for 2 hours, Dad left a roofing estimate unfinished and drove across town. But when I was 8 months pregnant and asked if someone could help me finish the crib, Dad texted, "Ask a neighbor, your mother is with Lila today." I stared at that message for a long time before I put the phone down. So I asked Maeve Donnelly. She lived next door, 57 years old, retired from labor and delivery, with silver hair in a braid and a voice that never wasted words. She came over with a cordless drill and no questions. By then, lowering myself to the nursery floor took planning. Maeve held one side of the crib while I tightened the bolts Caleb had ordered before he died. When we finished, she looked at the pale green walls, then at me, and said, "Some people promise loudly. Some people show up quietly. Learn the difference before the baby comes." Caleb Owen Price had been gone 8 months. A truck crossed the center line on Route 28, and just like that, the man who had chosen the crib, argued with me over paint colors, and kissed my belly every night became paperwork, condolences, and a house suddenly too quiet. My parents promised they would fill that quiet. My mother stood in the unfinished nursery, touched the wall, and said, "This baby will never be short on family." I believed her, because I needed to believe someone from my side would be there when Caleb couldn't. After the crib was finished, my father kept a spare key. He said it was only for emergencies, only so he and Mom could get in if labor started fast or if I needed help and could not reach the door. I handed it to him because I was tired, pregnant, and still foolish enough to think a key meant safety. 3 days before my due date, Dr. Celine Park looked directly at both my parents and said labor could begin at any time. My mother squeezed my hand and promised, "We won't miss it." That night, Lila called my mother before I did. At 10:18 that Friday night, the contraction that told me this was not practice folded me over the edge of the dryer. I remember the sound before I remember the fear. The machine had finished its cycle, but one metal button kept tapping against the drum, soft and steady, like a clock counting down something I could no longer postpone. I pressed one hand under my belly and reached for my phone with the other. My mother answered on the second ring. For one foolish second, I felt safe. "Mom," I said, trying to breathe through it, "I think it's starting." Her voice changed immediately. "We're coming, sweetheart. Your father is getting the car." I heard cabinets opening behind her, my father asking where she had put her purse. The small panic of people preparing to keep a promise. I sat down beside the laundry basket and stared toward the hallway, where the nursery door stood half open. I imagined my mother walking in, fussing over my hospital bag, telling me I had packed too many socks. I imagined my father pretending not to be scared. I let myself believe them because believing them still hurt less than preparing to be disappointed. 19 minutes later, my father called back. His voice was different, tight, distracted, almost irritated, as if my labor had arrived at an inconvenient time for the rest of the family. "Lila just called," he said. "She's in a parking lot near Shadyside. Brent left her there after some kind of fight. Your mother thinks she's having a full panic episode." Another contraction started while he was talking. I gripped the edge of the chair and said, "Dad, they're less than 5 minutes apart." There was a pause. Then I heard my mother crying in the background. She took the phone. "Nora, please don't make us choose tonight. Your sister is not as strong as you." I could not answer right away. Not because I agreed, but because the pain had locked my jaw, and something colder had locked my chest. "I'm in labor," I finally said. "I know," she whispered, "but Lila is alone." I was alone too, but my loneliness had never sounded urgent to them. I was alone in the house where Caleb should have been standing with the car keys, alone with my hospital bag by the door, and alone with my son pressing his way into the world. When I called again, no one answered. I texted my mother at 11:02. "My water broke. I need you." 7 minutes later, her reply appeared. "We're handling a crisis. Call an ambulance if you have to. We'll come when Lila is safe." I read it once. Then again. The words did not get kinder. The next contraction took my legs from under me, and I slid down onto the kitchen floor, one hand still wrapped around the phone. That was where Maeve found me 10 minutes later, breathing in short, broken pieces, while my mother's message glowed beside me like a receipt for everything I had finally lost. Maeve did not waste time asking questions the way frightened people do. She found me on the kitchen floor, looked once at my face, once at the phone in my hand, and said, "We're going now." Her car was already running in my driveway. She had thrown a stack of towels across the passenger seat and moved the hospital bag from beside the door before I could tell her where it was. I remember apologizing when more fluid hit the porch step. Maeve looked at me like I had said something ridiculous. "Nora," she said, "you are allowed to be the emergency." The drive to UPMC McGee Women's blurred into streetlights, wet pavement, and Maeve's calm voice counting with me through every contraction. She called ahead from the car, giving them my name, my due date, my doctor, and the timing of the contractions, like she had never truly retired. I tried calling my mother once more from the passenger seat. It rang until voicemail. I did not leave a message. I had already begged once that night, and something inside me knew that begging twice would not make me any less alone. Dr. Celine Park met us, not long after we arrived. She had warned my parents 3 days earlier that this could happen at any time, and I saw the question cross her face when Maeve, not my mother, stood beside me holding my bag. "Do you want us to call someone?" she asked gently. I gripped the rail of the hospital bed and shook my head before I could embarrass myself by explaining. Maeve answered for me. "Her family knows." Dr. Park's expression changed, not dramatically, just enough. The kind of change a woman recognizes when another woman understands more than she is saying. Labor did not give me time to decide how heartbroken I was. It kept moving. Nurses came and went. Monitors beeped. Someone adjusted the strap around my belly. Someone else brought ice chips I barely touched. During one contraction, I reached for a hand that was not there, and found Maeve's instead. She held on without making a speech. At 3:40, 2 inches the morning, Miles Owen Whitaker came into the world red-faced, furious, and alive. They placed him on my chest, and for a few seconds, the room narrowed to his heat, his cry, and the tiny weight of him pressing against me. "Hi, Miles," I whispered. My voice broke on his name. "Your dad would have been here." I looked down at his dark hair, damp against his head, and swallowed the rest. Caleb should have been the one crying beside me. My mother should have been calling everyone she knew. My father should have been pretending he had something in his eye. Instead, Maeve stood at my shoulder, wiping her own cheeks with the back of her wrist, and Dr. Park said quietly, "He's here, and so are you." At 8:17 that morning, my mother finally texted, "Lila is sleeping now. How are things?" I stared at the words while Miles slept against my gown. Not "where are you?" Not "is the baby here?" Not "I'm sorry." Just "how are things?" As if I had been waiting through a long appointment and not giving birth without her. I sent one photograph. Miles wrapped in a hospital blanket, his face turned toward my chest. My mother replied with 3 blue hearts and, "We'll come after we get your sister settled." That was when the first message from April Monroe appeared. I almost ignored it because I did not recognize the name, and exhaustion had made the edges of the room soft, but the preview stopped me. What's I? What's her sister posted last night before deleting it? Lila had tagged me months earlier in a baby shower post, back when she still wanted credit for being the fun aunt. "If you were really in labor, I think you should see this." Attached was a screenshot from a rooftop bar. Lila stood beneath string lights, makeup perfect, one hand around a pale drink. Brent Calder beside her with his arm hooked around her waist. Across the bottom, in Lila's own caption, were the words, "Tonight proves who really shows up when it matters." For a long time, I did not move. Miles made a small sound against me, and my hand went automatically to his back. There was no parking lot, no ambulance lights, no hospital bracelet. Just my sister, smiling into a camera while my parents chose her crisis over my labor. I enlarged the picture with 2 fingers. In the dark window behind her, Brent's phone was lifted near his chest. The reflection was blurred, but one name was clear enough to make my stomach go cold. Warren. My father's name was on Brent's screen, while Lila smiled under those rooftop lights. I did not know what that meant yet. I only knew one thing with the strange, steady certainty that sometimes comes after your life breaks open. Whatever happened that night, it had not been as simple as my sister needing help. By late morning, the screenshot from April sat in my phone like a stone I could not swallow. I kept opening it, not because I wanted to see Lila's smile again, but because my mind kept trying to force the picture to match the story my parents had chosen. A parking lot. A panic episode. A daughter too fragile to be left alone. But there she was, under rooftop string lights, posed beside Brent, while I was learning the weight of my son on my chest, without my mother's hand in mine. I did not mention the rooftop photo. Not yet. My parents arrived a little after noon. They had not come empty-handed. They brought a blue balloon, a stuffed bear from the gift shop, and, somehow, a gray folder. My mother came in first, eyes filling the moment she saw Miles. For 1 second, the old part of me wanted to hand him over, to let her cry, to let everyone pretend the night had been hard but understandable. My father stood behind her, jaw tight, looking around the room, as if he expected someone to accuse him before he had prepared his defense. "Oh, Nora," my mother whispered. "He's beautiful." She reached toward the bassinet, but I moved my hand to the side of it before I could think. Not enough to stop her forever. Just enough to remind both of us that she had not been there when he arrived. Her face changed. Hurt first, then offense, my father noticed. "Your mother has been through a lot tonight too," he said, as if the sentence belonged in that room. I had stitches, a hospital bracelet, and a newborn who had been alive for less than 9 hours. My mother had been through Lila, but I was too tired to fight and too clear to apologize. "I'm glad she's okay," I said. My father nodded, satisfied with words I had not meant as forgiveness. Then he placed the gray folder on the chair beside my bed. "When you're up to it, we need to talk about practical matters." The folder looked wrong in a maternity room. Everything around it was soft: blankets, gauze, pillows, tiny diapers stacked near the sink. That folder was flat, gray, and hard-edged, like it had been waiting for a weaker version of me. "Practical matters?" I asked. My mother sat down carefully, the way she used to sit beside a student who had failed a test. "Honey, you're grieving. You're recovering. You're alone in that house, with a newborn. Nobody expects you to make every decision by yourself." My father opened the folder. Inside were printed pages with numbers lined up in neat columns. Mortgage, property tax, utilities, roof repair estimates, daycare, formula, medical co-pays. My life had been turned into a spreadsheet before my milk had even come in. "This is not pressure," Dad said. "This is planning." I saw a line near the bottom labeled Estimated Available Equity, $74,000. Another section listed Lila's outstanding debt at $32,800, though it was not called Lila's debt, it was called Family Cash Flow Exposure. In plain English, it meant my sister's studio rentals, camera equipment, credit cards, and sponsored posts that never paid back what she spent to look successful had somehow become my responsibility. My mother touched my blanket and said, "Lila can't survive another collapse, Nora. You can." There it was again, the same knife, polished and handed over like a compliment. Because I could survive, they believed I should be asked to. "Why does Brent know my mortgage?" I asked. My father looked down at the papers. My mother looked at the baby. Neither answered fast enough. Then Dad said, "Brent understands real estate. He's just helping us look at options." "Us, not me. Us." I turned my head toward Miles, asleep with one fist tucked against his cheek, and felt something inside me go very still. They had missed his birth, and now they were standing beside his hospital bassinet discussing the house his father had wanted him to come home to. I did not yell. I did not throw the folder. I said, "I'm not selling my house." My father's mouth tightened. "Don't be emotional about this," my mother whispered. "We're only trying to keep the family from breaking." When they finally left, my father forgot the gray folder on the chair. I waited until the door clicked shut. Then, with Miles sleeping against me, I opened it again and noticed the small print in the bottom corner of the last page. Prepared by Brent Calder. Revised before hospital visit. I did not sleep after my parents left. The room kept dimming and brightening around me as nurses came in to check my blood pressure, Miles's temperature, and the feeding chart taped near the bassinet. Every time the door opened, I expected my mother to come back and explain herself in a way that would make the last 14 hours hurt less. She did not. So I placed the gray folder flat on my tray table, smoothed the corner with 2 fingers, and took pictures of every page: mortgage, equity, Lila's debt, Brent's name. My hands were still swollen from the IV, but they were steady. Then I messaged April Monroe. My thumb hovered over the screen before I typed, because part of me still wanted one clean explanation. Maybe the screenshot had been old, maybe the caption meant something else. Maybe I was too exhausted to understand what I was seeing. April answered in less than 3 minutes. The story was posted at 12:46 a.m., she wrote. She had screen recorded it, before Lila deleted it. When the video opened, Lila was laughing under those rooftop lights. "If Mom leaves me tonight," she said, lifting her glass toward Brent, "I'll know she never really loved me." Brent's voice came from somewhere beside the camera, smooth and amused. "She won't. Not if you sound scared enough." I watched it once, and felt nothing. I watched it again, and felt too much. Miles made a small hungry sound, and the anger in me had to wait while I lifted him, settled him against me, and learned how to be gentle with someone who had done nothing wrong. That was the first lesson motherhood gave me. Some truths can split you open, but the baby still needs to be fed. Maeve came back that afternoon with clean clothes and a paper cup of hospital coffee she admitted was terrible. I showed her the folder and the video. She did not gasp. She did not call my family names. She only sat down beside the bed and said, "You need someone who knows what to do with this." Then she gave me the number of Grant Hollis, a family attorney in Pittsburgh who had helped her niece after a divorce turned ugly over a house neither side wanted to leave alone. Grant called me at 6:30 that evening. His voice was calm in a way that made me realize how badly I needed calm. I told him about the birth, the spare key, the folder, the rooftop video, and the house Caleb had left behind. He listened without interrupting. Then he said, "Do not argue with people who want your panic. Document them." He did not promise to fix it. He told me what to preserve. He asked who had a spare key and told me to write down exactly when and why my father had received it. Grant told me not to post anything, not to threaten anyone, and not to send one long message trying to make my parents understand. "People who understand boundaries do not need a speech," he said. "People who don't will use the speech against you." After we hung up, I called Irene Price. Caleb's mother answered on the first ring, as if she had been waiting near the phone for days. When I told her Warren wanted me to consider selling the Brookline house, she went quiet for so long, I thought the call had dropped. Then Irene said, "Caleb was afraid of that." The words made my throat close. She told me there were copies of papers in her safe, the deed, the insurance documents, and a letter Caleb had written after we found out I was pregnant. "He wanted you and the baby protected," she said. "Come here when they discharge you. Bring Miles home to me first." At 9:14 that night, after Miles finally settled against my chest, my father left a voicemail. "We'll come by Sunday with Brent. Be reasonable, Nora. Don't make us do this the hard way." Irene brought us home to Erie after the hospital discharged us, not my home in Brookline. Her home, the quiet brick house Caleb had grown up in, with framed school pictures on the hallway wall and a bassinet already made up beside the guest bed. I sat in the back seat beside Miles's carrier, while the highway unrolled in gray strips beneath a low October sky. My body hurt in places I did not know could hurt. Every few miles, I looked down to make sure he was still breathing. Irene did not ask me to explain, she only drove. By Sunday morning, my mother had sent 9 messages. "We need to see the baby. This is hurting your father. Lila feels terrible. Brent only wants what is best for everyone." Each one came wrapped in concern and tied with blame. I had already forwarded my father's voicemail to Grant, but hearing Maeve say his truck was in my driveway made the threat feel physical. Her voice was low through the phone. "Nora, Your father is there. I sat up too fast and felt pain pull through my stomach. Is he alone? I asked. Maeve paused. No. Your mother is there. Lila too. And a man in a navy blazer. I asked Maeve to stay inside, but she was already by her front window. Through the phone, I heard the faint scrape of my own front door opening. My father used the spare key. The key, he said, was for emergencies. The key I had handed him because I thought needing my parents would be safer than needing no one. Maeve switched to video. The picture shook for a moment, then steadied on my porch. Brent stood beside Warren with a clipboard and a small laser measuring tool in his hand, like my grief had square footage. They went straight to the nursery. My mother opened the drawers where Miles's clothes were folded. Lila drifted behind her, holding her phone at an angle that told me she was recording, even if she was pretending not to. Brent pointed the laser toward the wall and said, "If we remove the crib, this stage is better as a second bedroom." I could hear my own breathing turn sharp. Irene reached for Miles before I realized my arms had tightened around him. On the screen, Lila picked up the quilt Irene had sewn and smiled. "This is kind of old-fashioned. We could donate it." That was when something in me went quiet. Not calm. Quiet. The kind of quiet that comes when pain stops asking to be understood and starts asking to be protected. Maeve's voice came through the speaker. "Warren, did Nora ask you to be here?" My father did not even look embarrassed. "I'm her father," he said. Brent laughed under his breath and answered the question he thought mattered more. "She's postpartum. She's not thinking clearly. By the time she calms down, the house could already be listed." I did not scream. I did not drive 2 hours back to Pittsburgh bleeding and furious. I did not give them the scene they would later describe as proof that I was unstable. I held my son, watched strangers in my own family measure his room, and let Maeve keep recording. Then I called Grant. My voice sounded flatter than I expected when he answered. "Tell me exactly how to make them stop." Grant did not tell me to calm down. That was the first reason I trusted him. Calm was not something you could order from a woman who had given birth, been abandoned, and watched her son's room measured through a neighbor's phone. Instead, he said, "Start at the beginning, not emotionally, chronologically." So I did. I opened a note on my phone with Miles asleep beside me and typed the first line with one thumb. 10:18 p.m. First contraction. Then I kept going, because time had become the only thing in that family that could not be talked into changing sides. By midnight, the timeline looked less like a diary and more like a map of a planned betrayal. 10:37 p.m. Dad called about Lila. 11:02 p.m. I texted Mom that my water broke. 11:09 p.m. She told me to call an ambulance if I had to. 12:46 a.m. Lila posted the rooftop story. 3:42 a.m. Miles was born. 8:17 a.m. Mom asked, "How are things?" Noon, Dad brought the folder. Sunday morning, Brent entered my nursery with a measuring tool. Seeing it in order did something to me. Pain became pattern. Grant asked for everything in its original form. Screenshots were useful, he said, but originals mattered. April sent the screen recording again, this time with the timestamp visible at the top of her phone. She also sent one message Lila had written 2 weeks earlier, after my baby shower. "If Nora keeps that house, Mom and Dad will never stop acting like she's the tragic one." I read it 3 times. The word tragic sat in my chest like something rotten. I had not wanted attention because Caleb died. I had wanted my son to have a safe room to sleep in. Irene brought Caleb's papers to the kitchen table the next morning in a blue fireproof box. She did not open it right away. Her hands rested on the lid for a moment, the way people touch caskets before they are ready to let go. Inside were the deed records, the insurance documents, copies of payments Caleb had made before the accident, and a folded letter with my name, written in his careful block handwriting. I had seen that handwriting on grocery lists, birthday cards, and sticky notes on the coffee maker. Seeing it on legal paper nearly undid me. The letter was not dramatic. Caleb had never been dramatic. It said, "If anything happens to me, Nora and the baby should not have to leave the house we built for them." That was all. One sentence. No speech. No grand declaration. But it held more protection than every promise my parents had made in the nursery. Irene looked across the table and said, "He worried your father would call selling practical." I pressed the paper flat with my palm. Caleb had known my family more clearly than I had let myself know them. Grant ran Brent's name while I fed Miles and tried not to shake. By afternoon, he called back. Brent was not operating as a licensed real estate agent in Pennsylvania anymore. He was calling himself a consultant through a friend's company after a disciplinary issue had made his own work complicated. "That does not automatically solve your problem," Grant said, "but it changes the shape of his involvement." I understood what he meant. Brent had not been offering family advice. He had been circling a house he had no right to touch, using my parents as the front door. By the time we finished organizing the files, I had a folder of my own. Not gray, white. Grant had told me gray belonged to people trying to make pressure look professional. Mine held a timeline, messages, videos, property records, Caleb's letter, Maeve's recording, and April's statement. I did not feel powerful. I was still sore, still leaking, still sleeping in pieces while Miles learned the difference between day and night. But for the first time since my mother turned away from me, I had something stronger than hurt. I had proof. When Grant closed the file, he said, "They still think this is a family conversation. Let them." I looked down at Miles, curled against my arm, his tiny fist resting under his chin. My parents had spent my whole life teaching me that family meant handling things quietly so no one outside saw the mess. But this time, quiet did not mean obedient. This time, quiet meant ready. Warren requested the meeting 2 days later in a text that sounded less like an invitation than a summons. No lawyers, no outsiders, just family. I read it in Irene's kitchen while Miles slept in the crook of my arm, his mouth still relaxed from feeding. For most of my life, those 2 words, just family, had meant the same thing. No witnesses, no records, no one who could tell my father that raising his voice was not the same as being right. This time, I sent the message to Grant instead of answering it. Grant called 15 minutes later. If they want a conversation, they can have one where the record stays clean. He offered his office in Pittsburgh, a conference room with glass walls, a long table, and a receptionist who logged every visitor by name. I agreed before fear could talk me out of it. Then I texted my father one sentence. "I will meet once, with my attorney present. Brent is not family, and has no reason to attend." Warren responded almost immediately. "Brent understands the housing situation better than you do right now." I stared at that sentence until Miles stirred against me. The housing situation. Not my home. Not Caleb's house. Not the nursery they had measured without permission. Just a situation. Something inconvenient to be solved by people who thought my exhaustion made me less entitled to my own life. A minute later, Lila sent a voice memo. Her voice shook in the practiced way it did when she wanted sympathy before facts. "You're punishing everyone because I had a mental health emergency, Nora. I hope you can live with that." I forwarded that too. On the morning of the meeting, Irene drove while I sat beside her with the white folder on my lap. Miles stayed in Erie with Maeve's sister, a woman who had raised 4 children and did not ask why I kissed his forehead 3 times before leaving. My hands felt empty without him. That emptiness helped me remember why I was going. I was not going to win an argument. I was going to make sure the people who had walked into my son's room understood that they would never again mistake my silence for permission. Warren arrived first, wearing his church coat and the expression he used with subcontractors who had disappointed him. Judith came behind him, pearls at her throat, eyes already wet. Lila carried tissues and looked smaller than she was. Brent walked in last with a navy blazer, a fresh haircut, and another folder under his arm. Grant stood, greeted each of them by name, and turned on the small recorder in the center of the table. Brent smiled like he still thought he was the calmest person in the room. "Nora," he said, placing his folder down before he sat. "We're all here to be reasonable." Grant looked at the recorder, then at Brent. "Good," he said. "Then let's keep the record accurate." Grant let Brent's sentence sit in the room for a moment. Reasonable. That was the word people used when they wanted you to make their comfort cheaper. I kept my hands folded on top of the white folder, because if I touched the papers too soon, Warren would know I had come prepared. My father leaned back in his chair and looked at Grant like he was an unnecessary piece of furniture. "This has gone far enough," he said. "She took our grandson and disappeared." Judith made a small sound beside him, like the sentence had wounded her more than it accused me. Grant opened a thin file but did not look down. "My client informed you in writing that she and Miles were safe in Erie. My office provided a channel for communication." Warren's jaw shifted. A lawyer should not be between a daughter and her parents. I looked at him then. "Neither should a locked hospital room, Dad. But you managed to be on the other side of that too." His face flushed. Judith whispered my name, as if I had said something cruel instead of accurate. Lila pressed a tissue under one eye. "I was in crisis," she said. "You keep acting like I planned this." I did not answer immediately. I had learned something from Grant by then. Silence makes some people uncomfortable enough to fill it with mistakes. Brent stepped in for her. Everyone was under stress. Nora had just lost Caleb, she was near delivery, emotions were high. "This is exactly why we wanted to create a practical plan." He slid his folder forward. "A single mother in a house she cannot manage is not stability. My son's nursery is not a business proposal," I said. Brent's smile thinned. Warren pointed at me. "That tone is exactly what I mean. You're exhausted. You're angry. You are not thinking clearly." Grant finally looked down and placed the first printed page in the center of the table. It was the email his office had sent Sunday morning, the one ordering them to leave my house and stop entering without permission. Attached beneath it was the delivery confirmation. "This was received at 10:42 a.m., Grant said. "You remained in the house until 11:18. Judith stared at the page. "We were not stealing anything." "No," I said. "You were deciding what could be removed before asking me." Brent gave a soft laugh. "That is not what happened." Grant placed the second page down. A still image from Maeve's video showed Warren at my front door with the spare key in his hand. My father's eyes narrowed. "I'm her father." For the first time, my voice did not shake. "A key is not the same as permission." Brent leaned back as if bored. "A father using his daughter's key is not a crime." Grant did not argue. He turned one more page and set it on the table, face down, like he was giving Brent a chance to stop talking before the room changed. Brent did not take it. "You people are turning concern into a legal performance," he said. Grant flipped the page over. It was not the worst evidence, not yet. Just a photograph of Brent standing in Miles's nursery with a measuring tool aimed at the wall. "Then let's talk about your concern," Grant said. Grant played Maeve's video without raising the volume. He did not have to. The room became so quiet I could hear the small click of Judith's bracelet against the table. On the screen, Brent stood in my nursery with his laser tool, measuring the wall where Caleb and I had once taped paint samples. Then his voice filled the conference room. "She's postpartum. She's not thinking clearly. By the time she calms down, the house could already be listed." Warren looked away first. Judith covered her mouth. Lila stared at the table. Brent gave a small, practiced laugh. "That is being taken out of context." Grant paused the video. "What context makes it appropriate for you to discuss listing a postpartum woman's home without her consent while standing inside her baby's nursery?" Brent's face hardened, but he did not answer. Grant turned another page. "Let's also discuss why there was a crisis the night Miles was born." Lila's head lifted. I had a panic attack. Her voice was softer now, but not soft enough to hide the warning in it. Grant clicked the next file. April's screen recording opened on the small conference screen. Lila appeared under rooftop lights with a drink in her hand, smiling toward someone off camera. Then her voice came through, clear enough to bruise. "If Mom leaves me tonight, I'll know she never really loved me." Brent's reply followed. "She won't. Not if you sound scared enough." My mother made a sound I had never heard from her before. Not grief, not shock. Something closer to recognition. Like a locked drawer had opened inside her, and she did not like what was in it. Lila began crying immediately. "That was a joke," she said. "You don't understand my anxiety." I looked at her then. "I understand that my water broke at 11:02, and Mom told me to call an ambulance if I had to." Grant placed the printed messages beside the still image from the rooftop. Then he added Dr. Park's note confirming that my parents had been warned 3 days earlier that labor could start at any time. The facts lined up without shouting. That was what made them unbearable. No one could soften them with tone. Finally, Grant turned to the spreadsheet Warren had brought to the hospital. At the bottom, in the section Brent had tried to shrink with small font and careful language, was a consulting allocation for $6,500. Brent's name was beside it. "So, your concern included payment?" Grant asked. Brent adjusted his cuffs. "That was a projected fee, if Nora chose to proceed." Irene, who had been silent beside me, laid Caleb's letter on the table. Her hand trembled, but her voice did not. "My son did not die, so this house could become your spreadsheet." The sentence landed harder than anything I had said. My father's face changed, but not enough. I turned to Lila. "Caleb showed up for Miles before he was even born. You made sure Mom and Dad didn't." Then I looked at Warren. "A key is not the same as permission." Grant slid a small envelope across the table toward him. "The first thing that happens today is simple," he said. "The key comes back." Warren stared at the envelope like it was heavier than metal. For a moment, I thought he would refuse just to keep some piece of authority in his hand. Then Judith whispered, "Warren." He reached into his pocket, pulled out the spare key, and set it on the table. It made a small sound when it landed. Almost nothing. But I felt it in my ribs. Grant slid the envelope back toward me without ceremony. That was the first boundary my parents had ever been forced to return. The rest did not happen all at once. It never does, no matter how people tell these stories later. Grant sent the formal notices. Brent's friend's company cut him loose from the McKees Rocks project when the video and the spreadsheet became impossible to explain. Lila lost 2 brand contracts after April stopped covering for her, and a bride recognized her from the rooftop clip. She cried online about being misunderstood, but the comments were not as kind as she expected. People believe tears until the receipts arrive. My mother asked to see Miles 3 weeks later. Not at my house. Not at Irene's. A public park halfway between Erie and Pittsburgh, with Grant aware of the time, and Maeve sitting on a bench far enough away to give me dignity and close enough to remind me I had witnesses now. Judith looked smaller without my father's speaking for her. She held a paper cup of coffee with both hands and said, "I thought because you were strong, you didn't need me the same way." I watched leaves move across the path before I answered. "That was never permission," I said. Her eyes filled. She asked if she could hold Miles someday. Not that day. I told her she could begin by telling the truth without asking me to soften it for her. She nodded, but I did not mistake nodding for change. My father sent one apology through email, written like a man assembling furniture from instructions he did not respect. I kept it anyway. Not because it healed me, but because proof had become part of how I protected my peace. I changed the locks on the Brookline house before I moved back in. Then Irene and Maeve helped me rebuild the nursery. The crib went near the window where the morning light came in. Irene's quilt stayed over the back of the rocking chair, exactly where Lila had decided it did not belong. I framed Caleb's letter and placed it in the closet, where only I would see it. On the dresser, I put the hospital photo of me holding Miles at 3:42. A.M. My face looked exhausted. My eyes looked awake. By Miles's first birthday, the room no longer felt empty. It smelled like vanilla frosting, clean laundry, and the lemon oil Maeve used on old wood. Irene rocked him while he clapped at the candle. Maeve took pictures. Grant sent a card with no message except his signature, which somehow made me laugh. My parents were not there. Lila was not there. Brent certainly was not there. And for the first time in my life, absence did not feel like punishment. It felt like space. Sometimes people ask if I regret leaving that nursery empty for them to find. I do not. That empty room told the truth before I was ready to speak it. It said my son was not a prize for people who abandoned me, not leverage for people who wanted my house, and not proof that I had to forgive on command. Being strong was never permission for them to abandon me. It was only the reason I survived long enough to close the door, change the locks, and build a home where my child would never have to earn protection. The lesson I took from everything that happened is this. Love is not proven by what people call you when life is easy. It is proven by what they protect when you are too tired, too hurt, or too overwhelmed to protect it yourself. For a long time, I thought being strong meant needing less. I thought if I could carry pain quietly, that made me mature. I thought if I did not ask for too much, people would finally see how much I had already given. But strength should never be used as an excuse to abandon someone. The people who truly love you do not look at your resilience and decide you can survive more damage. They look at your resilience and still choose to stand beside you. Family can be beautiful, but family can also become a word people hide behind when they want access without accountability. A parent, a sibling, a partner, or a relative can say they are doing something for the family while quietly asking one person to lose their peace so everyone else can stay comfortable. That is not love. That is control dressed up as loyalty. I learned that boundaries do not destroy families. They reveal them. The people who love you will adjust, even if it hurts their pride. The people who benefited from your silence will call your boundary cruelty. Let them. Sometimes the healthiest thing you can do is stop explaining your pain to people who already know where they caused it. Healing did not come because everyone apologized. It came because I stopped waiting for them to become safe before I protected myself. It came when I chose my son, my home, and my peace without asking permission. So if this story touched something in you, remember this. You are not selfish for protecting the life you are trying to build. You are not cruel for changing the locks, walking away, or refusing to hand your child into the same hands that hurt you. If you have ever been made to feel guilty for finally choosing yourself, share your story in the comments. And if this message stayed with you, please subscribe to the channel for more stories about family, betrayal, healing, and the quiet strength it takes to begin again.